Welcome, everyone. This is a joint hearing of the Subcommittee on Economic Growth, Energy Policy, Regulatory Affairs, and the Subcommittee on Crime and Federal Government Surveillance. We'll come to order myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Again, good morning and welcome to today's joint hearing with the Oversight, Accountability, and Subcommittee on Economic Growth, Energy Policy, and Regulatory Affairs, and the Judiciary Committee, Subcommittee on Crime and Federal Government Surveillance. I want to thank Chairman Biggs and his staff for joining us in this critical oversight hearing to explore and expose government overreach by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The Second Amendment to the United States Constitution plainly states, quote, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Shall not be infringed. Four key and critical words. Ever since Mr. Biden took office, his administration has actively sought to infringe on this right. And I'm deeply concerned that the ATF and their recent actions against firearms manufacturers, federal firearms licenses, or FFLs, and law-abiding Americans who wish to procure and use firearms. Under the Biden administration, the ATF has been weaponized against gun owners and Americans who wish to acquire firearms in numerous ways in recent years. The ATF issued the, quote, "frame or receiver," unquote, final rule in April of 2022, infringing on Americans' ability to assemble their own firearms from component parts. More recently, the ATF issued a final rule at the end of January of 2023 that will have an effective impact of criminalizing the possession of stabilizing braces in most instances, even though those braces were lawful to possess for over a decade by the ATF's own guidance. These braces were originally designed to assist disabled veterans who were physically unable to utilize traditional pistols for self-defense or to enjoy recreational firearms activity. The Congressional Research Service estimates that, now get this, approximately 40 million of these devices are already in circulation. On November 26, 2012, over a decade ago, the Obama administration, their own ATF firearms technology branch, issued a letter to Mr. Alex Bosco, one of our witnesses here today, and the inventor of the stabilizing brace. The letter clearly stated that the ATF finds that the submitted forearm brace, when attached to a firearm, does not convert that weapon to be fired from the shoulder and would not alter the classification of a pistol or other firearm. It also stated that such a firearm would not be subject to the National Act or NFA controls. In fact, they underlined would not be. It's underlined in the letter. Millions of people acquired stabilizing braces relying on the ATF's determination, and they did it in good faith, made over a decade ago under the Obama administration, that these ingenious devices were perfectly legal and did not convert a firearm into a short-barrel rifle subject to NFA controls. Now, anyone who has a stabilizing brace will be committing a crime after May 31st of this year unless they permanently remove and dispose of the stabilizing brace, turn in their firearm to a local ATF office, destroy the firearm, or try to obtain an NFA registration through a Byzantine process that includes marking the firearm so it can be traced. This rule will effectively turn many law-abiding gun owners into criminals if they fail to comply, even though Congress did not act. We didn't pass any new criminal laws or penalties related to stabilizing braces. We had unelected bureaucrats create a rule. It's not the way this should work. In addition to these overreaching regulations, the ATF has abused its enforcement authority at the direction of President Biden and other gun control advocates who simply don't care about the Second Amendment and, by extension, our Constitution, or the proper role of government. In June of 2021, Mr. Biden directed the Department of Justice to adopt a zero-tolerance policy when inspecting firearms merchants, known as, again, the FFL, and to revoke their license for any violation, no matter how minor or unintentional. This policy has led the ATF to revoking licenses on the basis of small and technical paperwork errors without showing any pattern, intent, practice, or materiality. Revocations have skyrocketed in 2022 alone. The ATF revoked 90 licenses, more than any other year in 2006. So at the end of the day, unfortunately, the actions taken by the ATF have clearly demonstrated that the agency has changed its focus from those who commit crime to law-abiding Americans who wish to exercise their constitutional rights. Instead of going after actual criminals, the ATF, by changing the rules without any input from Congress, is trying to turn law-abiding citizens into criminals. It's unacceptable, it's unfair, and quite frankly, it's unconstitutional. This hearing will examine how the Biden administration's ATF has engaged in a host of practices to chip away at your constitutional rights. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing today and look forward to their testimony. I now yield to Chairman Biggs for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be here today. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and your staff for hosting this important hearing today. The business before us today is a hearing entitled ATF's Assault on the Second Amendment. When is enough enough, close quote. And that really is the question of this. When is enough enough? That is a question that we have to resolve because there is a concerted effort to change the regulations that ATF has put in place and that millions of people have relied upon. ATF is engaged in various practices that seek to undermine the Second Amendment rights of Americans across the United States. The Biden administration has weaponized the ATF as it has weaponized every institution of our federal government. And this weaponization is an attack on law-abiding Americans. It is time for Congress to uphold the appropriate checks and balances by examining these actions by its own government against the American people. Hopefully today's hearing is just the beginning of holding ATF and countless other agencies under this administration accountable for its lawless overregulation of law-abiding Americans. And the good news is this is just the beginning of oversight, as we've been informed today that ATF will come to a hearing in April. We're having this hearing in part because the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives has abused its rulemaking authority delegated to it by Congress, this body. Earlier this year, ATF issued a final rule titled Factoring Criteria for Firearms with Attached Stabilizing Braces. That rule effectively bans pistol stabilizing braces nationwide. We will hear today from the inventor of those braces. Disabled persons, including the disabled veterans for whom the pistol brace originally was created, will lose the benefit of this useful tool and potentially their ability to operate firearms entirely. The final rule provides that pistols equipped with stabilizing braces meet the definition of a firearm under the National Firearms Act, and that any weapons with stabilizing braces or similar attachments that constitute rifles under the NFA must be registered. Under this rule, millions of law-abiding gun owners will be forced to remove their stabilizing braces from their pistols, install longer gun barrels, register their weapons as short-barreled rifles, or destroy their braced weapons or face felony charges. You heard that correctly. Millions of law-abiding Americans will be turned into felons overnight by the stroke of a pen and without any congressional action. In other words, by unelected bureaucrats who believe they can make law, apply law, enforce and adjudicate law. That is something every American should be concerned about, because that is the definition that James Madison wrote so eloquently in the 62nd Federalist, is the definition of tyranny. And it doesn't just apply to this agency. Those of you who applauded in this agency, will you applaud it in every other agency when an administration changes and you've been relying on a rule and it changes without your elected representative weighing in on it? This is not an international, but a nationwide threat. This is not what our nation's founders intended. This rule terrifies my own constituents. They ask me how Congress passed this law. They're shocked when I describe the administrative rulemaking process. They did not vote for this. They didn't elect the individuals making these decisions. And in fact, I didn't vote for this. That is a huge problem. The pistol brace rule exceeds the ATF's statutory authority. Congress has neither criminalized the use of pistol braces under the Gun Control Act, nor authorized their regulation under the National Firearms Act. To make matters worse, for more than a decade, ATF actually told the manufacturers and consumers of pistol braces that the devices were perfectly legal before this abrupt about-face. That can happen with every agency. I hope you're not applauding this abuse of bureaucratic authority today because you happen to be sympathetic with what this rule is. Because I can tell you, every agency can then turn on the American citizen. When ATF isn't exceeding their statutory authority criminalizing products they once deemed legal, they're making it more difficult for law-abiding Americans to purchase firearms by capriciously revoking the licenses of American gun dealers. The Biden administration, acting on behalf of the gun control lobby, has targeted firearm businesses. Another example, soon after taking office, President Biden demanded the Justice Department adopt a zero-tolerance policy to revoke federal firearms licenses from those who committed willful violations of the law. That wasn't what the law is. There was no statutory authority for that. But shortly thereafter, ATF updated its federal firearms licensee quick reference and best practices guide to state ATF will, absent extraordinary circumstances, initiate proceedings to revoke the license of any dealer that has committed a willful regulatory violation of the Gun Control Act for specified violations. ATF has begun to revoke the licenses of FFLs for simple, technical, and non-material paperwork violations, violations that are anything but willful. They are revoking licenses for minor paperwork violations that have no bearing whatsoever on public safety. ATF's overzealous enforcement of paperwork infractions is shutting down small businesses and diverting resources away from holding criminals accountable. FFLs and law-abiding citizens are not the cause of firearm-related deaths. The Biden administration knows this. If it were concerned with safety, they would not be the most soft-on-crime administration in my lifetime. Guns are not the problem. Law-abiding gun owners are not the problem. Violent criminals whose sentences are cut short due to lax prosecution, who roam the streets instead of being incarcerated, are the problem. The ATF should be directing its agents to go after these criminals, not directing their agents to check for technical paperwork errors from FFLs and chase down disabled persons with pistol braces. When is enough enough? Well, I think we have seen enough. And I hope that we can act to put an end to this ATF overreach. And I would suggest that the most effective approach is to reduce funding, or better still, eliminate all funding, and even better, eliminate this woke, weaponized agency. I yield back.
Now I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses today. Alex Bosco is a Marine Corps and Army veteran and the founder of SB Tactical and the inventor of the pistol stabilizing brace. Amy Schwerer is a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Ms. Schwerer is an expert on the Second Amendment and firearms in the United States, and in 2022 received the Second Amendment Institute's 2022 Gun Rights Champion Award. Mr. Help me with your last name. Losier? LaRosiere. Thank you. You are forgiven. Matthew Lorcier is an attorney and partner at the Zerme Lorcier. As an attorney, Mr. Lorcier has represented federal firearms licensees who have had their licenses revoked by the ATF. He has also written extensively on the Second Amendment and firearms law. And Rob Wilcox is the federal legal director at Everytown for Gun Safety, leading the organization's federal policy work, and has served on the board of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today on these very important issues regarding Americans' Second Amendment rights. I recognize the first witness, and we're going to go in a little bit of a different order here. So let's go with Mr. Bosco. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Chairman Fallon and Biggs, ranking members Bush and Jackson-Lee, distinguished members of Congress, my name is Alex Bosco, and I am the inventor of the forearm stabilizing brace and founder of SB Tactical. As a naturalized citizen, former member of the Army and Marines, and small business owner, it's my high honor to share with you my experience aboard the ATF regulatory roller coaster. My original effort to help a friend, an injured veteran, to safely and accurately participate in pistol shooting and then build a business has put me and millions of law-abiding Americans on a whiplash-inducing regulatory odyssey that has serious consequences, including imprisonment. I urge you and your colleagues to reverse the arbitrary, inconsistent, and capricious action of the ATF. The forearm stabilizing brace, which I originally designed to allow a disabled veteran to more accurately and safely enjoy the sport of pistol shooting, has been used by millions of law-abiding citizens to more safely shoot large pistols. Each SB Tactical product is designed as an orthotic device made out of an elastomer material, basically rubber, and has one or more flaps and a strap to safely secure the firearm to the shooter's forearm. The stabilizing brace is not a force multiplier. It merely adds an additional point of contact at the forearm to more securely hold a firearm. Since I began my business, I've made every effort to comply with all the rules and regulations set out by ATF. After submitting the original brace to the ATF for their review, ATF responded in writing stating that attaching a stabilizing brace, quote, would not alter the classification of a pistol or other firearm, and that, quote, such a firearm would not be subject to National Firearms Act controls. In the 10 years that followed, ATF repeatedly held that various pistol brace designs did not convert a pistol to a short-barreled rifle, and my business steadily grew. In 2017, ATF stated that incidental shouldering of a braced pistol does not result in a redesign and therefore is not a regulated NFA firearm, and that, quote, stabilizing braces are perfectly legal accessories for large handguns or pistols. Along the way, and at significant cost, I worked with attorneys, former ATF regulators, and even a former presidentially appointed ATF director to seek guidance from ATF whenever we made adjustments to the original design of the brace that I had submitted back in 2012. Shortly after his swearing in, President Biden decided to reverse the previous decade of ATF decisions on stabilizing braces. He ordered ATF to treat pistols modified with stabilizing braces as short-barreled rifles subject to NFA controls. This change, the President said, would require an owner of a pistol equipped with a stabilizing brace to pay a $200 fee, submit their name and other identifying information to the Justice Department, or face criminal penalties. The President even admitted that his goal was to make these changes, and I quote, without having to go through Congress. ATF responded to the President's directive and published a final rule on January 31st, 2023. The effects of this change are enormous. According to the ATF, millions of Americans who followed ATF's advice for the past decade have, unbeknownst to anyone, been committing felony crimes. And ATF almost certainly underestimates the scope of the impact of the rule. In the final rule, ATF assumes that there are approximately 3 million firearms with attached stabilizing braces in circulation, but ATF failed to include sales after 2020. SB Tactical alone sold more than 2.3 million braces since 2020. Unless this rule is put on hold by Congress or the courts, the company I founded and many others will go out of business soon. Furthermore, responsible gun owners will be harmed. None of them want to run afoul of the NFA as a result of ATF's flip-flop. But neither do they want to purchase new braces when ATF now says that in order to use these braces, people must register in a federal database and submit their photographs and fingerprints to the government. The effects of ATF's rule is to put out of business the industry that ATF itself fostered for 10 years and punish consumers who relied on ATF's prior decisions. Ironically, this rule eliminates an important and widely adopted safety feature that will arguably make the sport of pistol shooting less safe. Ultimately, this rule should be seen for what it is: circumvention of the legislative process. In Federalist Paper 47, James Madison observed that, quote, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. It is in Congress that the legislative authority is vested, and the President must faithfully execute those laws. The President and the ATF don't get to do both. I urge Congress to reverse ATF's arbitrary decision, take back its legislative authority, and strike a blow for liberty and good government. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bosco. The Chair recognizes Ms. Swearer for her 5 minutes.
Chairman Fallon and Biggs, Ranking Members Bush and Jackson Lee, and distinguished members of Congress. ATF is, in some respects, much like the guns that it is supposed to regulate. In a vacuum, ATF is neither inherently good nor inherently bad. It depends in large part on who controls it and the ends for which its power is exerted. Like all branches or forms of government, ATF is imbued with certain coercive powers that can be wielded either properly or improperly, and for either constitutionally sound or abusive purposes. ATF is not some natural-born villain. The agency was neither conceived in constitutional sin, nor did it come out of the executive branch womb covered in iniquity. It has the potential for tremendous good, and at its best, ATF plays a vital role in keeping Americans safe from violent crime. Unfortunately, ATF also has a habit of turning into its worst self when left unsupervised by Congress for extended periods of time. And that's a problem, because at its worst, ATF tends to use its vast and often unchecked regulatory powers to accomplish through agency rulemaking the very types of unreasonable and unconstitutional gun control measures that elected officials couldn't accomplish through the democratic process. The litany of recent abuses is long. Just last year, ATF, at the prompting of the president, implemented a zero-tolerance policy for violations by federal firearms licensees that has dramatically increased the number of licenses the agency revokes. Where the agency used to see itself as partners working with FFLs to ensure compliance with the vast array of federal gun laws, almost overnight it turned itself into an antagonist. The new policy presumes that many violations merit revoking that many violations merit revoking a license absent extraordinary circumstances, even for first-time violations. This zero-tolerance policy often applies to situations that are basically clerical errors or paperwork mistakes that don't result in any actual harm. And this is particularly ironic given ATF's propensity for sloppiness with its own firearms and records, which has sometimes resulted in actual harm. As Mr. Bosco explained, ATF also told potentially millions of American gun owners that despite a decade of ATF assurances to the contrary, their pistol-braced firearms were actually heavily regulated short-barrel rifles. And if these gun owners want to keep their pistol-braced firearms without immediately being branded as felons, they'd have to register each gun with the government and pay a $200 per gun tax. Otherwise, yes, the ATF is coming for their guns. In another recent rule change, ATF decided that Congress hadn't given it enough regulatory authority and decided it would rewrite federal law altogether. Whereas Congress said ATF could regulate firearms, anything readily convertible into firearms, and the frames and receivers of firearms, ATF told gun owners that actually it could, without any supporting statutory authority, also regulate almost frames and almost receivers. In addition to increasing the number and complexity of records that FFLs must maintain, ATF told them that these records must now be maintained indefinitely instead of for 20 years as under the old rule. And why, you ask, did ATF impose this tremendous burden on FFLs? Well, because it might help the agency in 0.002% of gun traces where having records older than 20 years might meaningfully further an investigation. And not all of ATF's malignant actions are recent. Federal law generally prohibits the importation of firearms and ammunition, except for those that are useful for sporting purposes. For decades now, ATF has maimed and mutilated the definition of sporting purposes in a purposeful attempt to inhibit Americans' access to commonly owned and constitutionally protected semi-automatic rifles. Despite the fact that millions of peaceable Americans routinely use these firearms for legitimate sporting purposes, to say nothing of other lawful uses, ATF continues to defy reality by insisting that they are not, in fact, useful for the sporting purposes. To be clear, Congress should not undermine ATF's legitimate efforts to enforce federal law and stop violent criminals. But it should absolutely step in to restrict ATF's discretion as to where it should focus its efforts and how it should wield its vast regulatory powers. It can and should consider statutorily undoing ATF's recent and not so recent attacks on the Second Amendment rights of peaceable Americans. You've asked us today, when is enough enough? How long, O Lord, will ATF continue being its worst self at the expense of peaceable Americans? Respectfully, the Constitution provides a clear answer. It's enough when you say it's enough, and it will continue until you do something to stop it. In my written submission, I've outlined a number of specific ways in which Congress can begin undoing ATF's problematic attacks on the Second Amendment and the separation of powers and prevent the agency from using these same abusive tactics in the future. I look forward to your questions on these important corrective actions.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Wilcox for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, Chair Fallon and Biggs, ranking members Bush and Jackson Lee, and distinguished members of the subcommittees and those who've waved on. I truly appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. My professional work on gun policy and gun violence prevention is deeply informed by a number of personal experiences. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York in the 1980s and 90s, where gun violence was not an uncommon occurrence. But at the same time, my father, who was a veteran of the Special Forces, taught us to respect firearms. At our family farm, we enjoyed hunting, sport shooting, target practice, and learned about responsible gun ownership, including securing our firearms in a locked gun safe. Unfortunately, my family's experience with guns took a violent turn when my 19-year-old cousin Laura was shot and killed by someone who never should have had a gun in the first place. Laura was extraordinarily talented, kind, and with a beautiful spirit. She was an outstanding student, graduating as high school valedictorian, and at the time of her death as a sophomore at Haverford College, was in the midst of her campaign for student body president. But in January 2001, when Laura was home on winter break, filling in as a receptionist at a rural county behavioral health clinic, a client came in and opened fire. He shot Laura 4 times at point-blank range, killing her instantly. When his rampage at the clinic at a nearby restaurant was done, 3 people lay dead and 3 more were injured. Another mass shooting in a long line of mass shootings that doesn't always break through the national media. My aunt and uncle processed this tremendous loss while also fighting for a safer future for others. They became advocates who turned pain into progress, working to pass dozens of gun safety laws, and they're role models. I've now spent 20 years of my career working on gun policy and law around firearms. And one thing I know for sure is that ATF plays an essential role in keeping us safe by enforcing the laws on the books. ATF is one of the nation's leading law enforcement agencies with 5,000 brave men and women doing work across this country in 25 field divisions and 200 local offices. Its mission is clear: to protect the public from violent crime. And they work hand in hand with our state and local law enforcement to solve crimes and do their job. ATF also regulates the gun industry through education and accountability, supporting those who want to do better and holding those who break the law accountable. ATF's role in this system is unique in its effort to keep communities safe. From 2017 to 2021, ATF processed nearly 2 million crime gun traces and 1.5 million NIBIN cases in order to assist local law enforcement in linking crime scenes, developing leads to solve crimes, and identifying gun trafficking channels. These crime gun traces show that guns are moving faster than ever from dealer to crime scene. Nearly half of these crime guns have a time to crime of under 3 years, and a quarter with a time to crime of under 1 year. Guns with short time to crime indicate trafficking, and it's where ATF and the industry can take action to step in and shut it down. Like, for example, when a gun dealer was selling multiple guns to people he should have known was intending to break the law. ATF traced those guns to multiple crimes, including murders. ATF investigated, and the licensed dealer, the gun traffickers, and the shooters were all prosecuted. The fact of the matter is that only ATF can make sure there's accountability from the shooter up to the supplier. ATF protects and serves at a time in this country when we need it to be at its strongest, fully funded and supported, because gun violence is threatening communities across the country. An epidemic exacerbated by rogue gun dealers, gun sales without background checks, and industry innovations like arm braces, ghost guns, and bump stocks. ATF boldly steps into this space to enforce the laws passed by Congress and stop the illegal diversion of firearms. It's truly not lost on me, as the ranking member mentioned, that yesterday was the 2-year mark of the shooting at a grocery store in Boulder, Colorado, where 10 people, including a law enforcement officer, were killed. The shooter used a short-barreled Ruger AR-15 pistol that came equipped with an SB tactical arm brace, the same kind of firearm that ATF now regulates. ATF has been there, time and again under Republican and Democratic administrations to respond to these threats and enforce our laws. Its mission is to protect the public from violent crime and stop gun trafficking. In other words, its mission is to save lives, keep illegal guns out of communities, and save the lives of concertgoers, lives of supermarket shoppers, lives of students, and so many others. And that's what ATF has done using the tools and authorities granted to it by Congress. I'm personally thankful for the men and women who are dedicated to their service at ATF and do this work to prevent senseless tragedies. Thank you again for the invitation to be here and look forward to the questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Lastier is recognized for his 5 minutes, my good Frenchman friend here.
Much appreciated. Chairman Fallon, Biggs, Ranking Members Bush and Jackson Lee, thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak on this important measure. I'm an attorney working in the Second Amendment space. I'm a child of immigrants, and I guess in following their lead, I decided to do a job that most Americans didn't want to, and that's protecting fundamental rights. I've been studying the law and policy of arms for over a decade, but I think most important for this hearing is my experience representing individuals and small businesses who have been caught up in some of the flip-floppery that ATF has engaged in. Representing individuals and small businesses that have had their lives shattered, their employees left jobless because of, frankly, innocent omissions that were characterized as intentional misconduct by the ATF. These individuals, oftentimes in the firearms industry, are employers with less than 15 employees. That's the majority of the industry here. And I've represented these people for nominal or no fee, frankly, because I feel it's the right thing to do. And what I've seen ATF doing in these prosecutions is extremely concerning. The threats that are posed by ATF's overreach are not theoretical. They're very real. And they're not limited to arm braces or the zero tolerance rule either. I'd like to tell you guys about Patrick Tate Adamiak. He was a 28-year-old Navy sailor, and he was recently convicted for dealing in machine guns. Now, looking at that headline might not cause you to take a second thought. But when you scratch a little deeper, the machine guns Tate was convicted of dealing in were actually boxes of cut-up, inoperable parts that the ATF had approved the importation and sale of as unregulated parts kits years ago. And then in an unpromulgated, unpublicized change of opinion, ATF decided that that amount of cut-up was not quite cut up enough. They'd secured a conviction, and again, 28-year-old Tate, who dealt in parts that were purchased in open commerce with a credit card, is now awaiting sentencing, and his plans of marriage are indefinitely on hold. I'd like to tell you about Matthew Raymond Hoover, who's a political commentator who is accused of advertising metal cards with a drawing of an alleged machine gun part on it. A drawing. ATF took the incredibly aggressive position and vindictively is prosecuted Mr. Hoover, suggesting that this drawing is actually a combination of parts. He is facing over 60 years in prison, a cancer-stricken man with not an ill-willed bone in his body, and several young children. I think it's important when we think about the pistol brace problem to look at what law we're dealing with. We're talking about interpretations of the National Firearms Act. This is an act that in its original drafts sought to regulate handguns. And this is why it sheds some light as to just how absurd the pistol brace problem is. Short-barreled rifles were added to the act to correct an obvious loophole to a handgun restriction. For it was raised in the hearings that if pistols were regulated, but you could simply cut down a rifle, well, that would be the effective equivalent of a pistol. Later on, to secure passage, the reference to pistols and revolvers were slipshottedly removed, but the vestigial remains of a pistol regulation, the barrel length restrictions, were there, leaving the rules that we're now dealing with, the law that we're now dealing with interpretations of, as kind of like a cancer-prone vestigial organ. It doesn't accomplish anything useful, but as many Americans and some of my clients have found out, it sure can get you into trouble. The argument that these guns under a law that was designed to designed to regulate concealable firearms become more dangerous when you make them less concealable by adding a component to the end is so obviously and intensely contrived, it's kind of absurd. Insofar as zero tolerance goes, the GCA, the Gun Control Act, has made federal firearms licensees the gatekeepers to access to the Second Amendment right for most Americans. What we're seeing now is a two-pointed prong where ATF is revoking licenses for little to no reason. I've seen it as simple. The violations they were alleged were as simple as a customer had filled out black as their race but not picked Hispanic or Latino. That didn't strike me as terribly nefarious. I think that ATF has a moral obligation to really look at how it is enforcing these laws. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Mr. Gates for his 5 minutes.
The Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office issues a report in June of 2016, Firearms Data. The ATF did not always comply with the Appropriations Act restriction and should better adhere to its policies. Mr. Wilcox, you're the witness the Democrats have invited here today. Are you familiar with that report?
I am.
And does the fact that the ATF broke the law concern you?
The report, I believe, supported ATF's action in cataloging records to stop crime.
I'll read from it. It says, a technical defect allows ATF agents to access data, including purchaser data, beyond what ATF policy permits. Do you take any umbrage with that conclusion?
ATF has been collecting out-of-business records pursuant to a law signed by Ronald Reagan, and President Trump digitized more records than any other president.
I don't care who did it. I'm just worried about the impact on my citizens. And I would acknowledge there may be Republican presidents who didn't do enough in the 80s to protect our gun rights. But on this finding, the ATF had to delete 252 million records, didn't they?
So this is a tool that's helped solve 50% of crime.
Wait. Did they have to delete 252 million records?
What I know about this tool is that it's a
That's not what I'm
crime-fighting
asking
tool.
you. Did they have to delete? You said you're aware of the report. Is that conclusion correct? They had to delete 252 million records.
I'm not aware of that line, but what I'm aware of is the
Well,
tool. crime-fighting tool.
I'll represent to you that that's what had to happen. The fact that the government collected 252 million records that was beyond the law, beyond policy, never approved according not to me, not to my fellow Republicans, but to the GAO. Should that be concerning to us, that scope of records being collected?
ATF's collection of out-of-business records was fully compliant with the law.
That's not what the GAO said, so you disagree with the GAO report.
Well, there's 2 points they made. One is the collection of out-of-business paper records that FFLs keep. The second piece was the collection of electronic records that FFLs keep. And what the GAO said was the electronic records were not being converted sufficiently. And that's what ATF
so that's why they
fixed
had to delete
become
them,
in compliance with the law.
Because they had gone beyond their authority. You see, that's the concern of my constituents. When they go beyond their authority, and you may find those things virtuous, but no one elected you. They elected us to make the laws, and when we make the laws and they don't follow them, then people's rights get diminished. Another area is this issue of the arm braces. Now, in Mr. Wilcox's testimony, he says that an arm brace makes a weapon more powerful. Mr. Bosco, you know a lot about arm braces, don't you?
I do.
Do arm braces make firearms more powerful?
They do not. They do not.
Does it concern you that the witness that the Democrats brought would make such a claim that is obviously disproven by any utilization of those arm braces?
I hope that my testimony today can help everyone here understand that the brace does nothing to make the weapon any more dangerous than it already is.
And so when you've got the ATF going beyond their authority, collecting 252 million records that they have to destroy, well, that can just be explained because they're doing their best. But when Americans get inadvertently converted to felons because the ATF has exceeded their authority, there is no such grace for them, is there, Ms. Swear?
That would seem to be the case under the recent policy change to zero tolerance.
Zero tolerance for our fellow Americans when they're trying to exercise their rights and protect their liberties, but all the tolerance in the world for a corrupt bureaucracy that is violating the law, exceeding their authority, and collecting records that they have no business collecting. I would make this final observation. I had the great privilege to spend 2 years on the House Judiciary Committee with the gentlelady from Missouri, and while she and I disagree strongly on this issue, her beliefs are sincere, and they are strong, and they are powerful, particularly when she expresses them. And so when she says to people that she wants to defund the police, she means it. And when she says in this committee meeting that gun violence is a public health emergency, well, she means that too. And our fellow Americans know the impact of folks up here in Washington declaring everything and anything a public health emergency. It means you're more likely to be locked in your homes, deprived of your freedoms, less healthy, less safe, less secure, and less able to live a truly American life. So know this, when the left talks about this as a public health emergency, get ready to see those enhanced authorities abused by the ATF. And, Mr. Chairman, it is my sincere hope that in the very near future, we will have those very folks from the ATF here. And I intend to be utilizing the new rules that we have in the House of Representatives to offer amendments to the Appropriations Act to zero out their salaries for breaking the law and abusing the liberties of our fellow Americans.
You see a gun like this, and you're like, how the heck is a barrel with that length a pistol? Well, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about SB Tactical and their stabilizing braces. 4 pistols.
The end here, which is a rubber type of configuration. It's adjustable if you want to run your arm through it, and do so you can, and tighten it down to your forearm, which of course is what the braces were originally intended for. However, with the ATF rulings now, you can occasionally accidentally fire in front of your shoulder.
Today on Sunday Gear Review, I want to talk to you about this SB Tactical HKPDW arm brace. It does help some people, right? So you can slide your arm through that and undo it and all that stuff. But we all know what these are actually used for, and nobody is wondering about that.
And we're going to just see, does it really feel like a stock, even though it's not a stock?
Back to this brace. It changes the game, like I said. It gives you 4 points of contact with the occasional shouldering. Got it loaded up? Let's see the difference.
Now you've got a very shorty boy, right? So you can put this guy obviously in a briefcase if you wanted to.
The chair recognizes Mr. Donalds for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quick, I find it interesting that my colleagues have no problem with the ATF going outside its boundaries with respect to this brace. Meanwhile, my colleagues have no issue with the fact that the President of the United States has made a complete bastardization of asylum at the southern border, which has led to more fentanyl killing more people between the ages of 18 and 45 in the United States. Fentanyl is the #1 killer of Americans in the United States, and they have no problem talking about that. They don't even want to discuss it, but we're here talking about this. Ms. Swearer, you just saw the video that was up on the screen. Do you have a response for this video?
Yes, though I suppose Mr. Bosco does as well. I think it's being used in a way to misconstrue the reality of SBRs. SBRs are actually still used by plenty of Americans who do have disabilities, but also just from the standpoint of SBRs themselves, they were the loophole, an attempt to regulate a loophole while trying to essentially ban handguns. Their restriction under the NFA has always been irrational. This idea that somehow a 14.5-inch barrel is more concealable than a 16.5-inch barrel when you walk in to commit a mass shooting, and that's why they choose it. It's just not realistic. It's the same gun. If you take that same gun and put it in a 16-inch barrel, if anything, the muzzle velocity will be increased when it is fired. So it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I'm sure Mr. Bosco has some thoughts on that as well.
I mean, Mr. Bosco, you're the inventor. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks. I think there's a lot of people online, and we've seen some of those videos. The reason I invented the brace was for people with limited mobility. Well, that was the inception. That was why I made it. It was for a friend. Yes, there are people that are not using my product the way that I've designed it to be used, but the intent has always been that. The idea that by adding a brace to a pistol, makes the firearm more concealable and therefore more dangerous is laughable. It's a piece of plastic. It weighs a certain amount. It makes the firearm longer. It's not making the firearm more concealable. It's making it less concealable.
Mr. Bosco, let me ask you a question. How many Americans do you think will become felons as a result of this rule?
Well, I think we should probably look at what Congressional Research Services did. They came up with a study that said anywhere between 10 and 40 million Americans own arm braces at this moment. If we use the smallest number that they have, which is 10 million, you will have an effect that come, I believe it's May 16th, which is the deadline. If someone wasn't smart enough to look up the Federal Register, who didn't know about this rule, from one day to the next, he will be in possession of an unregistered short-barreled rifle, and he will be committing a crime which is punishable of up to 10 years in prison. It's a felony offense, $250,000 fine.
So in order to avoid this, the American would have to spend $200, get their fingerprints taken, get a photo of them given to the ATF. Am I correct in that?
So the agency, even with this, has flip-flopped back and forth. Originally, they were suggesting that Americans pay $200. And
Mr. Bosco, not to totally cut you off, let me ask you this question real quick. Did Congress pass a law to stipulate the ATF do this?
Unequivocally, no.
Mr. Wilcox, how you doing? Fellow Brooklynite over here. Grew up the same time. Let me ask you this question. Do you think it's okay for the ATF to act outside of congressional legislative authority, criminalizing 10 million Americans who are currently law-abiding citizens?
It's good to see another proud son of Brooklyn. I don't believe that is what ATF is doing here, so I disagree with the premise.
Do you think that by this rule there will not be 10 million felons in the United States because they bought a product that the ATF authorized to be sold, and that the ATF said was legal up until the Biden administration?
So not liking a law isn't a reason for ATF not to.
Well, Mr. Wilcox, there's no law. Congress didn't pass it. That's a rule from ATF. Let me ask you this question. Do you believe in separation of powers?
Of course.
Do you believe that the legislative power resides within the congressional body and not the executive?
I do.
So then why do you think it's okay for the ATF to come up with some rule with the force of law that Congress did not pass?
Congress passed the law 90 years ago, and ATF is catching.
So you're saying to me that a law that Congress passed 90 years ago allows for 10 million Americans to become felons today?
Congress passing a law allows ATF to regulate as technology changes.
Come on, Mr. Wilcox. Don't do that to the American people. We know better. Don't do that. I yield.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Ms. Boebert for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's interesting hearing the rhetoric from the other side of the aisle. I used to say we don't differ in our hearts. We differ in data. No one wants to see children injured or even lose their lives. However, especially since serving in Congress, I've seen that Democrats do differ in their hearts because they're doing nothing to save lives in the womb. We had a Born Alive Act where one Democrat voted in favor of a full-term baby who is being aborted and survived that abortion, would be born alive, and then issued medical care to save that child's life. So we do differ in our hearts. I have not seen my Democrat colleagues defend innocent life, but they want to use these talking points of children in tragic, horrible scenarios as a political pawn to regulate law-abiding citizens. Now, for far too long, rogue politicians and partisans at the ATF have really run amok, infringing and trampling on the Second Amendment, the rights of the American people. This shall not be infringed, period. There's no comma after shall not be infringed. And it's trampled on by the federal government, by the states and local governments on a regular basis to disarm Americans, to make them subjects rather than citizens. And I stand by the statements that I made because this is to protect the people from a tyrannical government, and it's for self-preservation. This is to defend yourself, your life, which is so valuable. But anyone remember, since we are talking about the ATF, and Mr. Chairman, I actually second Mr. Gates's comments. I would love to have the ATF in here so we can actually question them on this rule. But do any of you remember Project Gunrunner and Operation Fast and Furious? Yeah, the fact that the ATF allowed 1,000, no, more than that, thousands of guns to end up in the hands of Mexican cartels and criminal organizations, and they lost thousands of these traced firearms. And then one of these guns was used to kill border agent Brian Terry, all through some brilliant government program. And it's absolutely outrageous. If you think the ATF is going to be successful in this, making millions of Americans felons through this rule that is an overreach of the separation of powers. You've heard it from the witnesses today who don't necessarily agree with my stance. Mr. Wilcox says that it's us that make the law. Congress makes the law, not bureaucrats. And they're seeking to make millions of Americans felons with this rule. Now, what happened with Fast and Furious, with these traced guns that they lost, thousands of them? The records in question, a judge found that they were not covered by privilege and that they were supposed to be released to the American people. Well, what happened to those records? That's right. Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats ended the House lawsuit when they took control in 2019 and further buried this scandal. Absolutely shameful. As the National Shooting Sports Foundation has pointed out, in just the last 5 years, ATF, under political pressure, has at least on 3 occasions, through administrative fiat, changed long-standing positions to declare products lawfully sold in full view of the ATF and in reliance upon ATF classification letters to now be illegal and or regulated under the National Firearms Act. ATF bureaucrats are not only ignoring the direction of Congress, they are literally ignoring the law and trying to rewrite it themselves. A complete separation of powers. And I apologize, I did have some questions for the witnesses, and I do thank you all for being here and providing testimony. But hearing this on the other side and then just realizing that we differ in data as well as in our hearts, because we do want to protect innocent lives. That is why we support the Second Amendment. It is your right to defend yourself, and we will always speak up to defend life. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Moore for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, let me say mass shootings are defined when you have a shooting with 3 or more people die. We had 74 people in the U.S. die in mass shootings last year. We've had 107,000 opioid overdoses. Number one killer of people between the ages of 18 and 45 is opioid. And based on testimony we've been hearing about the open border, they're getting younger and younger. So if we really, really care about young people in this country dying, we need to address the issue of opioids and those poisonings, that sort of thing, rather than this type of hearing here and trying to come after law-abiding citizens. Mr. Bosco, I have a district that has more veterans in it than any district in Alabama. I have Fort Rucker and Maxwell Gunter. And, you know, one of the things we do for wounded warriors very often is we'll take them offshore fishing. I've hosted a couple of tournaments and take them out, let them shoot, hunt. It kind of gives them their life back. It gives them opportunities to do things. So tell me a little, when you invented this pistol brace, what was your motivation?
Well, I mean, I was at a range. A lot of us veterans enjoy shooting sports, shooting guns safely. And a range officer was out there, and he essentially told my buddy that he didn't want him shooting the weapon the way he was shooting it because, in his opinion, he was firing it unsafely.
So now your buddy is...
He's a vet.
Wounded warrior?
Yeah, he's a wounded warrior, lost a limb.
Go ahead, sir.
And he essentially, obviously you obey the range officer's rules. But the initial impetus was to get this guy back out there shooting a firearm safely. And I think it did a good job of that, and it's brought a lot of other veterans back to shooting sports. It's the one thing that all of us enjoy doing. You know, I don't even think my colleague would disagree that it's something that veterans do. I mean, his father did it. I train my kids the right way. It's something that really helps. It's cathartic to other veterans, including wounded veterans, and it's cathartic to people who just want to go out there and enjoy it. I mean, there shouldn't be any. I really don't think there's. I mean, we're all talking about Second Amendment issues here. I was really looking forward to talking about how this brace helps other people, how it helps wounded veterans, how it helps people with limited mobility. It's a piece of plastic that allows people to shoot a firearm better. That's what it is.
You know, and my daughters shoot, and I understand that the brace allows 3 points of contact. So some of the wounded among us, some of the weaker maybe, couldn't hold a handgun. It allows them an opportunity to shoot as well. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. All it does is allows for a third point of contact to help you fire the weapon more safely. Nothing about this product makes the weapon any more dangerous.
Wait, no, so you're saying, number one, it doesn't make the weapon more dangerous. Actually, it probably makes the weapon safer.
It does.
And more accurate, I would think, which is a good thing when you're firing down range, I would assume. You want to hit targets, right?
Exactly.
So thank you for that. And Ms. Swear, I got to move quickly here. I want to ask you, are you aware of any data that suggests that an increase in firearm ownership leads to an increase in violent crime?
No, not on the whole. It's all about who in particular has that firearm and whether it's for criminal motives. But generally speaking, law-abiding citizens are not, who are the mass of gun owners, are not having that violent intent, and they're therefore not a danger to themselves or others.
Are you aware of any law that would stop gun violence? Is there a law that we could pass as Congress that would actually stop murders in this country by firearms?
Congressman, even if you could pass a law outright banning guns, you'd still have to be able to snap your fingers to make them disappear out of the hands of violent criminals, and it would be an impossibility to eliminate gun violence. We can certainly work on getting guns out of the hands of violent criminals and enabling law-abiding citizens to defend themselves with that lethal force, as is their natural right and their constitutional right. But to suggest that we can somehow eliminate gun violence, I mean, that you're talking about eliminating human nature and this propensity that violent people have to commit crimes.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Rwanda where they killed all those people with machetes, right? It's more about human nature, actually, than it is the weapon we happen to be using. You know, it's interesting because most of the cities that are controlled by the Democrats, I moved to D.C. and I'm here part-time. I've only been in Congress 24 months. But you guys, I feel so much less safe here. And this is, I mean, they're pretty restrictive on firearms. So much less safe here than I did in the hometowns I grew up in, the cities in my states. Because number one, we're carrying concealed, so we're safe in that respect. But just the crime that we're seeing in the cities where they think they can pass a law to change human morality is just, it's staggering to me. And the statistics simply do not support that approach. But with that, Mr. Chairman,
I recognize Mr. Fry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President Biden and the ATF purposely decided to put a plan together to take millions of law-abiding citizens and turn them into felons after May 31st, just like that, through a rule on stabilizing braces, which is nearly a total ban. This action, despite prior guidance from the ATF, Mr. Bosco, as you testified earlier, to the contrary. Does that sound crazy? Of course it does, but this is just another day in Joe Biden's America. Inaction by this body is sanctioning a lawfully established good actor in the community, your company, Mr. Bosco. Let's just change the rules midstream. In order to register firearms under this proposal, gun owners are required to destroy, turn in, rebuild their guns, or fill out what is called a Form 1. This is the Form 1. It is a 17-page guidance on how to fill out a government form. This means that owners of up to 40 million braces will spend a collective 160 million hours registering their lawfully acquired firearms to comply with ATF's unconstitutional rule. Anyone who does not register, turn in, rebuild, or destroy their brace firearm by ATF's arbitrary deadline will be subject to a 10-year in federal prison or $250,000 per firearm. These aren't illegal guns. These are lawfully acquired guns. For perspective, in 2020, ATF reported they processed 512,000 National Firearms Act gun registration forms at that rate, assuming no further backlog and assuming all affected gun owners comply with gun registration date by May 31st. It would take the ATF over 78 years to process all of the pistol registration forms. The ATF is proposing regulations they aren't even capable of handling. Ms. Swear, who is in charge of making the rules, making law in the United States of America?
That would be Congress.
Would you say that it's a fair assessment that ATF is attempting to usurp Congress's powers and undermine the Second Amendment?
I think ATF in recent years has sought to do that in several ways, yes.
In what ways? Curious.
So as I noted both in my written and my opening remarks, so one of them is with this pistol brace rule. So Congress, yes, I think irrationally in 1934, but nonetheless did seek to regulate short barrel rifles. And ATF for a long time took the position that these were not short barrel rifles. And then just like that, it changed its mind and said we're going to override that. With respect to firearms themselves, ATF decided unilaterally that even though Congress said we can regulate firearms and frames and receivers of firearms, well, we think now we can regulate almost frames and almost receivers, which is really just a hunk of drilled out metal. It's not a functional firearm in and of itself. And in that way, we're going to claw back more power for ourselves. So I think you see this quite a bit of ATF not just interpreting the law, but intentionally misinterpreting the law to give itself more power.
The pistol brace ban is unconstitutional, it's irresponsible, and it's quite frankly downright maddening. In this poster behind me, you see two guns. Mr. Bosco, would option A or option B make you a felon under ATF's proposed rule?
Well, option B in 120 days will make you a felon.
Do you think the common American citizen would reasonably be able to distinguish which is the firearm of a felon versus a law-abiding citizen?
Well, that's the whole point here. I mean, this is what I was talking about. Again, I have no disagreement with Ms. Jackson-Lee. I have no disagreement with my colleague with respect to what the ATF does. But this is not what the ATF should be doing. The ATF is making a rule, okay, and they're saying that this rule has criminal implication. It circumvents the legislative process. That's what's happening here. All I'm saying, and all I have been saying, is that ATF should not be making laws. That's up to the people up in front of me.
What makes this firearm behind me illegal under the ATF proposed rule?
Well, essentially what they're saying, after 10 years of saying the opposite, is that the piece of plastic attached to the back of that firearm, which is a piece of rubber with two flaps and a strap, is now a stock similar to the one in A.
Does the arm brace make the firearm more deadly? For example, does it turn a semi-automatic weapon into a machine gun?
It doesn't turn the firearm into anything. All it is an orthotic device that allows you to fire that weapon in a more safe fashion.
What is the impact of this proposed rule, if enacted, to your company?
We'll go out of business. We'll go out of business. The ATF itself said that 4 of the 5 companies will go out of business in their impact study. They said that. So they know that they're doing this.
Has the federal government ever indicated to you that they would be willing to compensate you for shutting down your business?
Never.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wilcox, did you or anyone in your organization communicate with the ATF or the Biden administration about these issues we are discussing today prior to the notice of proposed rulemaking?
We submitted formal petitions for rulemaking through the appropriate channels, sir.
Before the notice of proposed rulemaking?
That's correct.
So you were in communication with the Biden administration wanting to make these changes?
We filed formal petitions for rulemaking through the appropriate channels.
Who'd you talk to?
It was a written submission, sir.
Did you speak to anyone personally?
I didn't.
Did anyone in your organization talk to anyone?
I have to check, but I believe we submitted the written submission as a formal submission.
People in your organization may have talked to folks at the ATF prior to the notice of proposed rulemaking?
Not that I'm aware.
Did anyone in your organization talk to Mr. Dettelbach before the notice of proposed rulemaking?
I don't believe Mr. Dettelbach had
You came in
nominated.
afterward. Have anyone talked to Mr. Dettelbach about this personally?
Of course, we've been in communication with the ATF in this administration and in prior administrations.
Talking to the director? You've talked to the director?
I mean, we work with ATF across administrations.
Have you talked to the director? It's a simple question.
Yeah, I've communicated with the director.
You've talked to Mr. Dettelbach?
Of course.
Yeah. And well, I find that interesting. I just know, as we're speaking upstairs, the president of the National School Board Association is sitting for a transcribed interview because the same thing happened there. National School Boards Association talked with the Biden White House, the Biden Justice Department, the Biden Department of Education, concocted this letter that set in motion this whole attack on parents showing up at school boards. And it looks to me like we have a similar operation going on here, where you guys worked with the ATF to change something that had been the law for 10 years to go after law-abiding Second Amendment Americans. Second Amendment supporting Americans. Mr. Bosco, you invented this stabilizing brace, is that right?
That's correct.
And you invented it for a Marine buddy, a friend of yours who served our country and was injured?
That's correct.
And you were told 10 years ago that the stabilizing brace does not convert a pistol into a short-barreled rifle. Is that right?
That is correct.
I got the letter right here from the ATF, November 26, 2012, right? And then 7 weeks ago, 180-degree change, right? 180-degree change, just the opposite. They now say it is just the opposite of what they told you 10 years ago.
That's
Again, I know others have talked about this, but I think it's so clear. 180-degree change. So in 10 years and 2 months, the rule was one way, and you developed a business based on the rule that they told you. Your government told you this was fine, and now they've changed it.
That's correct.
When did the bill pass that changed the law?
There was no bill.
No bill. That's the fundamental issue, right? No bill. Mr. Dettelbach, the new director, he never ran for Congress. I don't remember a bill going through Mr. Nadler's committee last Congress that changed the law. I would have known because I'm on that committee, the Judiciary Committee, which has jurisdiction over this stuff. I would have known. I don't remember a bill passing the full Congress. I don't remember a bill in the Senate Judiciary Committee passing or going through the Senate. And I certainly don't remember a bill going to President Biden's desk that he signed the legislation that changed the rule. But this could potentially impact millions of Americans, law-abiding, Second Amendment supporting Americans. Is that right, Mr. Bosco?
That's absolutely correct.
How many products have you sold, just your company alone, to Americans? How many stabilizing braces have you sold?
Many millions. I can say that from 2020 to today, which are the years that the ATF didn't concern itself with when it did its impact study, we sold, our company alone, 2.3 million braces.
So while they were doing their study, they didn't count the number of braces that were being sold?
They didn't count in their impact study.
That's probably because Mr. Wilcox's organization told them not to count it, right?
I don't want to...
Well, they were talking to him all the time, it sounds like, putting this all together, going after people who support the Second Amendment. How many Americans do you think it's total? So I've heard estimates as many as 40 million Americans could be impacted by this?
Correct. Congressional Research Services has said anywhere between 10 and 40 million Americans own stabilizing braces.
Unless you remove the brace, lengthen the barrel, turn in or destroy your firearm or register your gun with this government that you know you can trust because Mr. Wilcox has been working with them, you know you can trust. Unless you do those four things, what happens? What are you?
A felon.
A felon. A felon for something 10 years ago they said was just fine. That you built a business on, and the business started because you wanted to help a man who put the uniform of his country on his back and served our country and was injured, and now they're going to put you out of business and make people felons. But don't worry, Everytown USA, Mr. Wilcox has been working with our government to implement this to target Second Amendment people, Americans who support the Second Amendment. Such a deal. Such a deal. That's why we need legislation to say this rule does, we need to pass that. That's what we do need to pass into law now based on what has happened with this organization. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes myself for my time. Mr. Wilcox, is a stabilizing brace a ghost gun?
No.
Okay. So I just want, for the record, to recognize the fact that our Democratic colleagues were in charge of this chamber for 4 years, and there was no legislation passed to regulate or ban ghost guns. In fact, it wasn't even marked up. And my colleague just said that they were begging for action. Well, you had 4 years, and you did nothing about that particular issue at all. We are talking about a stabilizing brace, and we're also talking about bureaucratic overreach and an end around to the democratic process. And I suspected that we were going to be insulted, and I wasn't disappointed. So, Mr. Wilcox, is it your firm belief that less guns will equate to less violence?
Thanks for the question, Chairman. It's my belief that strong gun laws lead to less gun violence.
So less guns is better.
No, strong gun laws lead to less
Guns are. What is stricter laws going to do? It's going to limit gun ownership, wouldn't it?
So we looked at every state across 50 policies, and what we found is the states that had the strongest suite of policies had the least amount of gun violence. Well, that's not what I'm asking. And furthermore, it's you can play a game with states. You can compare Vermont to Texas, and it's a very comparison. I can also compare North Dakota to California, and you're not comparing apples to apples. So I think that it's very interesting to point out that in 1980 in this country, there were 226 million people. We had 23,040 murders. It was a murder rate of 10.2 per 100,000. And there were approximately 280 million guns. In 2019, there were 400 million guns, so a significant increase. There were 16,425 murders for a murder rate of 5.0. We understand that one murder is one too many. But you can't legislate away evil. Gun control in Mexico is very strict. In fact, for all intents and purposes, it's very difficult for an average Mexican citizen, although the Constitution says they can own a gun, it's very difficult for them to do so. And also, every single firearm in Mexico is supposed to be registered. Mexico has 124 million. My firm belief that if you look at Mexico with 124 million people, the murder rate in this country is 5 per 100,000. Mexico, with very strong, strict gun laws, the murder rate is 29 per 100,000. That is remarkably higher. So how can that be? If laws can wash away, unfortunately, human nature, they can't. And evil is evil. Whether someone is murdered with a gun, with a knife, with a car, a bomb, or even with your bare hands, the fact of the matter is, what a firearm does is equalizing the playing field, particularly for elderly and for women, for folks that may not have the physical strength to defend themselves. So when we recall apologists for gun violence, we're using this for political tools, insurrectionists, and we're out of step. This is about the democratic process. We are supposed to pass laws. Congress, not unelected bureaucrats. If that's the case, we can all just go home. I'd rather spend more time with my family, quite frankly, my 13 and 16-year-old sons. I want to keep them safer. I want to keep everybody in this room safer. And I find it very hypocritical that some members of Congress hire armed security to protect themselves with firearms. So firearms are okay if they protect them, but not other people. The great masses. Alcohol-related deaths in 2020, 13.1 per 100,000. We talking about regulating any more alcohol? We talking about banning it? We're talking about making new rules to make it harder to get alcohol? No. Deaths by car, vehicles, 38,824, 11.2 per 100,000. Anybody want to ban cars? Any talk of that? No. Mass shootings. One is too many. In November 2021, in Wisconsin, a driver drove his SUV through a Christmas parade and he killed 6. Was there any talk of banning cars? No. We weren't going to ban the Ford Escape he used or any like them. The Ford Super Duty pickup truck in October of 2017 in Manhattan. Drove his truck along a bike path and crashed into a school bus, killing 8. There was no talk of that. It's not the gun that kills people. It's the person pulling the trigger. A gun is merely a Chair recognizes Mr. Perry for his 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman.
Sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Biggs. Okay. Mr. Perry, go ahead.
We're trying to balance, right? We're trying to balance the safety of the citizens in the United States of America with this God-given constitutional right. It's enshrined in the Constitution, came down from God, that we can defend ourselves. We're trying to balance that, and that, I think, is what this discussion is about. And then who does that balancing, whether we are a nation of laws or a nation of hysteria and screaming, which doesn't seem to produce much, but a bunch of screaming. And I get that people are exercised, but there are people here that are elected and accountable to make the laws. Unfortunately, in this case, folks that aren't accountable seem to be making the laws with the power to put you in jail, the authority to put you in jail if you disagree. Mr. Wilcox, are you a gun manufacturer?
Are you asking if I'm a licensed gun manufacturer?
I'm just asking if you're a gun manufacturer.
I'm not.
Licensed or otherwise. So you're not. Have you made a so-called ghost gun?
I have not.
You've not. What are the tools necessary to manufacture the so-called ghost gun?
So I've worked with a number of veterans who have made this, and to make the handgun model, if you buy the polymer frame with the kit, what you need is a hand drill and a hand file. So actually these aren't motorized tools or battery-operated tools at all. They're just working with muscle power. And
so you've done it. When you said you've worked with them, you stood right next to them, you held the tools, you're saying a hand drill, and what was the other thing? A file?
A hand file. Yes, sir. I'd be happy to send you the link. It's on YouTube. It actually shockingly has 4 million views of people seeing these hand tools in under an hour convert this frame into something that can be used in a firearm.
So you don't have the tools, and you're talking about that you've assisted veterans doing it, and I can go watch on YouTube. Do you think that everything you see on YouTube is real?
I sure hope not, or my kids would be in trouble.
Okay, all right. Well, look, I think that's fair. What are the components of what you characterize as a ghost gun?
Look, the core of the ghost gun is the frame or the receiver that can be readily converted into operational status. An ATF is making
So hold on a second. Let's be clear. The frame or the receiver, or the frame and the receiver? What is it?
It's a good question, sir, but the frame
I know it is
for the handgun and the receiver is for the long gun.
So a handgun doesn't have a receiver?
That's correct.
And a long gun does?
Correct.
Interesting. On YouTube, when you watch this video, so to speak, at what point did the components, or forget the YouTube, when you personally assisted with a hand drill, not even an electric, you're talking a hand drill with a crank, right? When you were assisted with that, at what point did those components become a gun?
When Polymer 80 was selling those parts, those are firearms and should be regulated as such.
At what point did it, so when it was in the package and it showed up, was it a gun?
Yes, that's a
You
firearm.
could fire it. You could fire it when it showed up in the package.
That's not what the law says, sir.
No, I'm asking you. When it showed up, however it showed up at the house, in the package, before the drill, the hand drill, and the file, was it a gun?
Yes, sir, because Congress has defined firearms.
Could you fire it?
That's not how Congress defined firearms, sir.
And how does Congress define firearm?
An operational weapon.
Is it operational when it shows up in the mail? The components?
Yes, sir.
So why are you filing and why are you drilling it?
Because the firearm definition is operational. Or
No, I'm asking you, if it doesn't work when it shows up, why do you have to do those things? Sir, the point is it's not a gun. At what point are you going to outlaw, or are you going to sanction the ATF outlawing a block of aluminum, a block of steel, a screw? And by the way, you have no idea what you're talking about regarding receivers or frames. Sir, you are unqualified to comment on this because you have no idea what you're talking about. You haven't manufactured anything. Let's face it. You have no idea. Sir, I'm going to turn to Mr. LaRosiere. Do folks that kill other people, do they apply for permits when getting a gun?
Certainly not in my experience.
Criminals. Do criminals go out to their local gun shop and fill out the paperwork and pray to the good Lord that they're not found out to be criminals when they want to purchase a gun?
I think it would be odd for them to do that, so no.
I yield the balance, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Chair recognizes Mr. Tiffany for his 5 minutes.
Mr. Bosco, we're hearing about banks and other lending institutions that are not lending to companies that make firearms, make munitions, things like that. Are you familiar with that?
I am, yeah.
Tell us how pervasive it is.
Well, I mean, as a small business owner, when you start off a company, obviously somebody like myself who does not come from money had to go through typical lenders to try and find funding for what I was doing. And the minute you either, you need to find a smaller bank, essentially. If you use a larger bank and you say what you're doing, essentially they'll tell you no. So there's no other place to go other than smaller lending institutions.
So what do you think when you hear that the ability to lend is being suppressed?
I believe it.
So where is it driven from?
I mean, it's a politicization. You certainly have people in banks that have political opinions, and what they do is they use those political opinions to essentially stop you from obtaining any money from them.
So there's a real-world example going on right in our state of Wisconsin at this time. I believe it's the Bank of America has cut off a company that is involved in producing these types of products. And unfortunately, a regional bank who really does a good job, it's good for them. They're going to pick up that business. But you got one of the big banks that are just saying, you are now persona non grata. Wouldn't you kind of put this under the heading of ESG?
I would, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I hope I say your name correctly, Mr. LaRosiere. Do you have any comments in regards to that issue?
As far as debanking the firearms industry, it's been an incredible source of tumult for my clients, and especially when you're talking about small businesses, fewer than 15 employees, then having to pay exorbitant rates, for things like credit card processing. That's why I'm glad that measures have been taken in states like my own in Florida to kind of put a stop to that. But I'm also involved in the firearms industry, and I can certainly say that most people will have to either find some unconventional loans or self-start and bootstrap, and very often resort to credit cards, whereas other businesses don't have that problem.
Thank you. Mr. Wilcox, if a person lies on Form 4473 and is a user of unlawful drugs, you can get between 5 to 10 years for that. Is that correct? Is that my understanding?
No, I believe Congress changed the sentence last Congress.
What is that sentence now?
Up to 15.
Up to 15 years. Why hasn't Hunter Biden been prosecuted for the crime that he committed?
I'm not aware of the facts of that case and can't comment on it.
Okay, who do we talk to see why this case is not being prosecuted? I mean, he said very clearly in his book that he used drugs, he had at least a gun.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
State your point of order.
Totally irrelevant and not germane to this proceeding.
Sir, he's got his 5 minutes. Go ahead, continue.
It's not a court of law.
Okay, so I understand why you do not want Mr. Wilcox to answer that question. It's very clear why you don't want, because there's a dual system of justice in America. That's what's going on right now, and everybody's talking about it across America. There's two standards of justice that are going on. So I'll just close by saying this, Mr. Chairman. You know, time and again we find ourselves addressing these cynical plays by the Biden administration. Now they're going after the gun-owning people of America, by the way, the legal gun-owning people across America, and it's always using administrative law to do it. This is nothing but a cynical ploy that's going on by the Biden administration, trying to score points with those people that are in their corner of the American public. All you got to do is look at what happened with the student loan thing. It was an election year gambit that went on. They were trying to motivate young people to get out and vote. And how could they do that best? By playing the Supreme Court and Republicans off, oh, those are those evil people that are going to make you have to pay off your student loan. By the way, I have 2 daughters that have student loans and they should pay it off. They signed a contract. Our family signed a contract. They should do it. And yet this is this kind of cynical stuff that goes on with the Biden administration all the time. And this is no different. This is no different at all. It's time that my colleagues on the left in the Biden administration stop trying to unconstitutionally make law-abiding citizens into criminals. Stop using administrative law the way you're using it. I yield back.
The chair recognizes Mr. Clyde for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Subcommittee Chairman Fallon and Subcommittee Chairman Biggs, for allowing me to...
You can just call us Chairman. That's fine. You don't have to be specific.
Chairman works. But thank you for allowing me to participate in this joint hearing. As one of the few federal firearms licensees in Congress and a small business gun store owner for over 30 years, I've had a lot of experience working with ATF. Our unalienable right to keep and bear arms, this fundamental freedom, is certainly under attack by President Biden and the ATF. With the new frame and receiver rule, the pistol brace rule, and now the most recent attempt at universal background checks through President Biden's executive order. On January 13th, the ATF finalized its pistol brace rule, which unlawfully treats firearms with stabilizing braces as short-barreled National Firearms Act restricted weapons, effectively turning millions of law-abiding gun owners, including many disabled veterans, into criminals in just 120 days. Unelected anti-gun bureaucrats announced to law-abiding gun owners possessing these pistols with these attached braces that starting on January 31st, they have only 120 days to register, turn over, dismantle, or destroy their firearms. Failure to comply with this unconstitutional measure will result in up to 10 years in jail and a $250,000 fine. The ATF's abuse of rulemaking authority dangerously violates American Second Amendment rights, irresponsibly disregards Congress's sole legislative authority, and reveals yet another uninformed flip-flop decision by anti-gun bureaucrats at the ATF. Back in 2012, pistol braces were determined legal to use and shoulder. The decision was reversed 3 years later in 2015. Claiming stabilizing braces were illegal to shoulder, turning pistol-braced firearms into unregistered short-barrel rifles. This changed again in 2017 when stabilizing braces were once more determined to be legal to shoulder. And now here we are in 2023 as the ATF is yet again vilifying pistol braces and turning their owners into criminals, and in the process destroying the hard work of entrepreneurs and small business owners like Mr. Roscoe. To help with this injustice, this week I introduced the Joint Resolution of Disapproval, HJ Res 44, under the Congressional Review Act with Congressman Richard Hudson, as well as the support of over 180 of my House Republican colleagues as original co-sponsors to repeal the tyranny of ATF's misguided and unconstitutional pistol brace rule. This ATF rule and every other form of gun control pushed by the Biden administration is nothing more than a thinly veiled assault on our Second Amendment rights. It is yet another attempt to advocate backdoor gun control in order to disarm our nation and dismantle Americans' Second Amendment freedoms. The intended end result would be an unarmed America, which would make for a less safe and less free America. Mrs. Swearer, will the ATF's pistol brace rule reduce crime and save lives, do you think?
Almost certainly not. In fact, it's mostly liable to create felons where there were not felons before instead of attacking violent crime as it currently exists.
And by the tens of thousands of them.
Yes, sir.
So if the intent is not to reduce crime and save lives, what do you believe is the purpose of ATF's pistol brace rule?
I firmly believe that the intended purpose is simply to try to do something, if you will, about gun violence in the typical way of, well, look, we've done something. We've regulated more. The problem is the regulation is not directed at the violent criminals themselves. It's directed at millions of peaceable citizens who are not and never were the problem. Meanwhile, to the extent that it is regulating these devices for would-be violent criminals, well, congratulations. They have a plethora of other ways of either obtaining that same firearm, because if they're not prohibited and just spent on violence, they can pay the $200 tax and they still have the same firearm, so we haven't even cut down that option for them. Or they can turn around, as most of them do, and break other laws, obtain firearms off the street with pistol brace or no pistol brace, NFA or not NFA. And as most of them do, they're already not using these firearms. They're using non-NFA firearms.
Right.
It just is not directed remotely at any part of the problem.
Mr. Bosco, in 2012 and 2017, the ATF found pistol braces were not subject to the National Firearms Act controls. Has the basic design of stabilizing braces changed over the last 6 to 10 years?
The brace has been the same thing that I've done in 2012. It is a piece of rubber that attaches to the back of the firearm with 2 flaps and a strap, and it allows you to fire the weapon more safely. It does nothing to change the lethality of the firearm.
Okay, so why do you think ATF flip-flopped and then flip-flopped again on the decision process concerning the legality of the pistol brace accessory?
Because the political winds at the ATF changed. That's simply it. They needed to do something, anything, and the one thing that I think a lot of people wanted to talk about was the brace issue. And they talked about it, and the process through which they're doing it is this promulgation of regulation. And now, after I don't know how much time, I mean another 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months, 10 to 40 million Americans will be criminals.
Gentleman's time is
Thank you.
expired. Chair recognizes Ms. Luna for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I just wanted to start out by saying that probably not just on this committee, but in the entire House of Representatives, I am the only member of Congress that has both survived an armed robbery, a home invasion, a gang shooting on my school campus, and I remember being a young girl and being brought to a cousin's funeral that had been murdered. She was shot. So when I hear people trying to turn this, which is a hearing on a stabilizing brace, into issues of gun violence and raising the topics and concerns of children and violence against children, I would like to remind people that in Washington, Chairman, if I could submit these to the record, in Washington,
So moved.
thank you, we are allowing for late-term abortion, and these babies were born alive. And my colleagues are not acknowledging that. So I just want to put that in perspective, that I don't believe that this is about protecting children. I believe that this is a political argument from people that have not gone through experiences and are seeking to use this platform to write legislation that's unconstitutional. So my following questions are for Ms. Sawyer. Do you believe that firearms and women that have firearms is apparently anti-woman?
Yeah, so this has been something that's been raised several times in this hearing, this idea that guns don't protect women. Of course they do. And I personally take offense at having my natural right to self-defense mansplained to me by members of this body who come to work every day protected by armed men with guns, very much believing that those guns are keeping them safe. And I tend to agree with them that those guns are, in fact, a large component in keeping them safe. I would also point to the defensive gun use database that we run at Heritage. So many of those instances involve women who otherwise would have been at a physical and strength disadvantage, who were able to use essentially self-defense at a distance to take on and defend their rights in ways they otherwise would not have been able to.
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Bosco. Mr. Bosco, as I'm sure you may know, one of the leading causes of death in this country is obesity. Do you believe that we should place a ban on spoons?
I don't think spoons should be regulated, but if they are regulated, it should be Congress that does it and not the FDA.
Do you believe that somehow controlling someone's spoon access is going to prevent them from becoming obese?
I don't believe that will make any difference, no.
Well, I'm so glad you've clarified, because clearly in this instance, and actually, I'd like to follow up with one more question. For veterans that are disabled, would this law turn those veterans who have served their country, regardless of party affiliation, into criminals?
So this law will place burdens on every American who owns them, and it won't allow people to own this product without following through the process. So will veterans not be able to use the product? They will have to register their firearms and go through a burdensome process of doing it.
If a veteran is unaware that this has passed, would that turn that veteran into a criminal?
Well, anyone who doesn't read the where you can find all the regulations is not going to know about it, and they will be subject to a 10-year felony offense. So, and I don't know how many people read promulgation of regulation on their spare time. I know that a lot of us do here. But I can certainly tell you that there's a lot of gun owners in the United States that don't know anything about this.
What the ATF has done with this administration, with the weaponization of this agency to take something that is basically done to aid people that are disabled and then make this about protecting children from a majority of members who have never experienced gun violence and or seen the direct outcome of what happens when bad people obtain guns, of which you will never be able to regulate, is not only an abuse of, I think, authority, but it's unconstitutional. I thank you for being here today, and Chairman, I yield my time.
Recognizes Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To all of you, thanks for being with us this afternoon. Mr. Wilcox, we probably have gone through this, but I just need to clarify a couple of points to help me make a point. And this is irregardless of the fact that many of my colleagues have, and a couple of the witnesses have already made the point that The laws of this land should be made by Congress, not by any federal agency, so I'll skip through that. Did you testify that a pistol brace will not change the capacity of a firearm?
I don't believe I was asked that question.
All right. Will a pistol brace change the capacity of a firearm?
What do you mean by capacity, sir?
The number of rounds.
No, sir.
Will a pistol brace change the firing speed of a firearm?
No, sir.
Will a pistol brace... Well, let me back up there just a minute. And so what I hear you saying is a pistol brace will not change the basic mechanisms of a firearm that makes it more dangerous.
No, sir. I don't think that's precisely correct.
Mr. Bosco, are you familiar with a Form 4473?
I am.
All right. Are you an FFL dealer?
I am.
Yeah. So am I. It's getting to be a smaller and smaller club. I'm glad we're here. On a Form 4473, there are basically two types of firearms referenced. Will you tell us what they are?
One is other. The other one, well, there's pistol, rifle, and there's other, or receiver is what we call it.
So, depending on the form, long gun, handgun. Which of those is typically more regulated by the states?
Pistol.
And so we saw a diagram that Mr. Fry had here a while ago of a long gun and then of a pistol that had been made into a long gun. Can you help me think through the rationale of why anyone would want to make a gun, or would want to prevent us from making a gun that looked like and behaved like one that was less regulated? Is there some logic there that you can see that I cannot?
I've not seen much logic, with all due respect to everybody here, and I think the problem is that a lot of people really aren't informed about what is and is a pistol and what is and isn't a rifle. And frankly, it's very nuanced, so in their defense, it's hard to really understand all of this. So what I would say is that the product is a safety device. My colleague was talking about innovation for safety when it comes to vehicles, and that's what's helped vehicles be safer. Well, this is an innovation for safety for firearms. All it does is help you fire a large pistol more safely. It does nothing to change the lethality of the firearm. Mr. Cicilline as well showed the picture. It's a terrible thing that happened. But whether my product is on there or not changes nothing, and it hasn't changed anything for 10 years. All of a sudden now we're going to say that a pistol is a short-barreled rifle? It's not the way things are done. If they want to make that change, they can make that change through Congress. ATF should not be able to make and say that a firearm all of a sudden is something else. It's not the way it should work.
Thank you. And so what I heard here is that a pistol brace does not change the firing capacity of a short gun, and a pistol brace makes a short gun, into a long gun, which is even less regulated, and that seems to defy logic. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I'd like to yield the rest of my time to Ms. Luna.
I just want to correct for the record, as words matter, especially here in Washington, that I did not say I was the only person, but I am definitely the only person that has those listed experiences. So to take my words out of context, I'm not in the business of listening to if people are offended. I'm in the business into finding the facts, and the facts is that I have one job, and that is to uphold and defend the Constitution, and for people to try to take that and then use this position, clearly that, again, I will reiterate that we are focusing on a brace, not gun violence, and the rest of these topics and rabbit trails that they're going down. The point is that bad people will always obtain guns, and regulating the rights of law-abiding citizens to do other than that is not going to do anything but enable the bad guys.
Chair recognizes Representative Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce for the record a copy of a bill, H.R. 1678, titled the Protecting Legal Firearms Ownership Act of 2023. This bill was given to staff prior to the committee, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous
Without objection.
consent that- Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, evil is not born in the mechanisms of man, it's born in the heart of man. Been a lot of passionate discussion here today. Let's call it that. There's no such thing as gun violence, ladies and gentlemen. There's only human violence. It's intellectually unsound to assign an act of violence to a mechanism of man. So we are an assemblage of people, and sometimes it's quite inconvenient to my colleagues that lean left that we live in a representative republic and we are a constitutionalist nation. So the Constitution doesn't say a lot of things we wish it would, does say some things that others don't like, but it most certainly grants every free American the right to keep and bear arms. It says that right shall not be infringed. And we have a balance of power, Mr. Chairman, as the founders intended, between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And the executive branch is intended to have broad and sweeping authorities. And when you have an executive branch that abuses that authority, you don't change the authority, you change the executive. That's what elections are for, and that's what we'll do. So in the meantime, we're responding to ATF oppression of our Second Amendment rights very calmly and judiciously, because we have that right as American citizens to uphold our right to keep and bear arms. That's what this legislation does. The Biden administration, with the stroke of a pen through an ATF rule, is forcing Americans into felony possession of illegal firearms with the stroke of that pen. So this legislation maintains the legal possession and ownership of a firearm or a firearm attachment according to the rule regime that existed when it was legally owned and possessed. Pretty simple response to the oppression we're seeing out of the federal government. Ms. Swearer, thank you for being here. Do you recognize that the founders intended to give broad authority to the executive branch?
No, the authority of the executive branch, just as for all branches of government, is fairly limited, and certainly the executive branch is not tasked with such broad authority to create or pass or legislate laws into existence, just to enforce those.
Solid answer. We can debate about that when we have more time. I would suggest that the language of the Constitution does indeed intend is what I call executive authority. There's no votes, there's no legislation passed, there's no judicial procedure. It's executive authority. So when that executive authority is abused and infringes upon our constitutional rights, do we not, as Americans, you're a constitutionalist, good lady, I'm sure, do we not, as Americans, have the right to respond and stand for our rights?
Well, certainly the congressional branch has the opportunity to respond with both other branches for checks and balances.
We can write legislation, but individual Americans have that right to stand, correct?
We certainly have the right to.
What I'm getting at with this is that Americans were left out of this loop. They purchased a weapon legally. They went to their gun dealer, they gave their information, they had their background checked, they purchased their weapon, they brought it home, they've committed no crime, and yet they've been criminalized by the Biden ATF. And my colleagues across the aisle can deny that if they want to. But what I just stated is fact. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing me to participate in today's joint committee hearing, and I yield.
Chair recognizes Mr. Roy.
Thank my colleague from Texas, and I would simply note, and I just came from another hearing, I know we've got votes coming on the floor, the extraordinary concern that we have with bureaucrats making law. Right? I mean, that's at the crux of this. We can talk about guns, we can talk about putting bad guys in jail. I'll do that in a minute. But at the crux of this is a bureaucrat making a unilateral decision to try to turn millions of Americans into felons, to advance a radical leftist agenda, which is clearly what is at play. And I wonder if, Ms. Swear, if you could comment, to the extent you already haven't, but just to reiterate, the extent to which the unilateral action by bureaucrats at an agency, at ATF, to do what Congress has not done, how that is clearly in violation of our separation of powers principles at play.
So our Constitution, as you mentioned, is set up with separated powers. You have the executive branch whose job is to enforce the law, and you have Congress who passes laws because Congress is held accountable to the people. They are the ones who are elected. No official at the ATF is, or any other agency, is elected and held accountable through the democratic process.
And you believe the ATF has abused its rulemaking authority here?
Yes, and it has done so in a way that infringes on rights without the American people having a process by which to recall those appointees.
And so, therefore, is it your position that the rulemaking in question is, in fact, unconstitutional and unlawful?
Yes, in several capacities.
And therefore, it being applied to American citizens would be unlawful and unconstitutional. And therefore, Congress, in its duty in separation of powers, has an obligation to check that overrun executive branch. Would the gentlelady agree?
I would, yes.
Well, I appreciate that. And, I would note, I heard one of my Democratic colleagues earlier, complaining that if we were to go after individuals who are violent criminals, that somehow that would put more people in prison. Yes, that is in fact the goal and the objective of that effort, is if people are violating the law and they are violent and they are a danger to society, then yes, I want them to be in prison. And as a former federal prosecutor who prosecuted bad guys with guns under Project Safe Neighborhoods, a bipartisan effort to try to target criminals who are using guns to carry out violent acts and crime against the American people, yes, I put bad guys in jail. And I'm glad. I'm glad. I hope we can put more bad guys in jail. But I don't want to put law-abiding citizens in jail who are exercising their Second Amendment rights and being able to defend themselves in their communities. And yet, that's what we're having an executive branch bureaucrat unilaterally decide to do. This should send shivers down the spine of all members of Article 2. And look, I don't view this through the lens of it being a Democratic administration. I didn't like it when the Trump administration was doing stuff like this. Whether it was the bump stock ban, I didn't like that either. But my colleagues on the other side of the aisle no doubt loved that because they loved the policy outcome. I thought that was bad. I thought it was bad that you go down the road of using executive power with respect to building a wall, which I support. I do support building a wall. But I don't support unending use of emergency powers to carry out that kind of executive action. And I introduced legislation in the previous administration to address that. Because I think we should actually, on a bipartisan basis, try to stand up against the overreach of the executive branch. And in fact, it is our duty in Congress to do so, irrespective of which party is holding power in the executive branch. I would only ask one last question, Mr. Bosco. When you were involved with the creation, development of the stabilizing brace, in your wildest dreams, did you think a bureaucrat would try to say that you didn't have a Second Amendment right to be able to use that? And could you please extol and accentuate the benefits of the brace?
I never would have thought that ATF would unilaterally make a decision through the bureaucratic process to ban my product. Again, and as I said before, that's up to you guys. That's not up to a bureaucratic agency. The product was designed, again, as a safety product, an orthotic device. It changes nothing on the firearm. I have no disagreement with ATF's ability to do their job of putting criminals in prison, but I don't think anybody on this side should agree to give the ATF the authority to unilaterally make a product illegal and circumvent the legislative process. That's the only reason I'm here to talk about with you guys, is to say that. I don't want ATF to do that. If you want to do that, then you do that. But don't let an executive agency circumvent your power, your authority.
With that, I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Longworthy.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today to discuss the crucial need to uphold the Second Amendment. And I know our witnesses today and many of my colleagues will agree that the right to bear arms is one that we must do everything in our power to uphold and defend for the American people that elected us. Now, Mr. Laverzeri, are you at all familiar with the ATF's Form 4473, the firearms transaction record?
Yes, sir.
Can you explain the evolution of this document?
So this began in the Gun Control Act, right, which is what established federal firearms licensees to begin with. And originally this document, you'd effectively just attest that you were non-prohibited. Of course, over time, what makes an individual prohibited has expanded rapidly. But for right now, I guess your question is what do you include on the document? So personal identifying information, name, address, a proof of a piece of ID, and then the firearms that are to be transferred.
Okay. I believe it started off as a one-page document. It's now a 7-page document, and I will say that even when I tried to download it, it took a very long time. The ATF has made it very hard to acquire the document, and you need certain system requirements, and then you have to go through several hoops just to download it, and I hear a lot of feedback from our constituents on that. Can you speak to the language in the document?
I can mostly from memory, yes.
Okay. Constituents in my district have said that it's become so complex that it's deterring people from obtaining and purchasing weapons.
So the instructions are certainly very obtuse, right? There are yes and no questions on the front. They ask for identifying information. They ask for identification on the firearm. Then there's a whole additional box whether or not you picked it up on the day of purchase. So it can be quite complicated, especially in jurisdictions where you have a mandatory waiting period.
Okay. Do you believe that the agenda of the ATF was to make the document a deterrent for law-abiding citizens to purchase firearms?
I believe that the Gun Control Act was pretty facially a deterrent to the interstate transfers in arms.
Okay. Now I want to move on and talk about pistol braces. Mr. Bosco, we have all heard the story about why you created the pistol brace. And innovation like yours is what makes this country exceptional, and we applaud it. Why would the ATF impose rules against your pistol brace?
I mean, I can't speak specifically to why or what the ATF did. I do know that it is a political issue. So essentially, the political winds at ATF changed after 10 years. And they decided that that was something that they were going to go after. We do understand that there were people, there was a transition team involved when Trump finished his presidency, and there was a Biden transition team that went into ATF and requested ATF, asked them what things should we be working on, and those were the points that President Biden pointed out in his first speech about firearm regulation in his first weeks in office.
Well, I do know that constituents of mine, specifically returning veterans who go to ranges, think it is an absolutely great innovation. It is very helpful to them in their lives. And lastly, Ms. Swearer, do you think that the recent ATF rules that are allegedly meant to deter crime might be leading Americans to obtain weapons in illegal fashion?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood that question.
Okay, some of the various ATF rules and regulations that have been put on the books in the last several years, do you believe that they've been intended to make our law-abiding gun owners and purchasers appear to be acting in an illegal fashion?
Well, I'm not sure that the intent is to make it look that way, but in practice, that is what happens is you have law-abiding, peaceable citizens who, especially in the case of this pistol brace rule, are sitting there with their lawfully obtained firearms, and then a lot of times even without their knowledge, because they're not paying attention to what goes on in regulatory rulemaking processes. Overnight, they are now felons, whether they recognize it or not. So in practice, regardless of what the intent is, In practice, this is not directed at violent criminals. It is directed at and has the effect of creating criminals out of peaceable citizens.
That's great. In my home state of New York, many regulations have been put on the books that have drastically deterred legal gun dealers from selling to law-abiding citizens in preventing them from purchasing arms. Can you speak to what ridiculous gun regulations are doing to the law-abiding gun owners and legal gun dealers?
Again, I would say, I know that time is essentially expired, sure, but to summarize, it has that same effect, regardless of what the intent is. In practice, the biggest impact that it has is to create criminals where there were not criminals previously. It's not directed at violence or violent crime.
Thank you very much. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right, we're going to recess and reconvene immediately after votes, so I'd say about 10 minutes after votes, and we are now in recess. The committee's called to order, and the chair recognizes Mr. Biggs for his time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for being here today. All of you, and even though I disagree with Mr. Wilcox on many things, we've encountered each other before in other hearings, so I appreciate you being here as well, and I appreciate all of you and your testimony. Passionate and thoughtful. If somebody were to just join us, just real briefly, Mr. Bosco again, pistol brace is designed to do what?
A pistol brace is an orthotic device designed to help people with limited mobility, including our wounded veterans, fire these large, unwieldy pistols in a more safe manner.
Does it make it, and it does not make the gun more lethal?
It is not a force multiplier, no.
All right. Well, let's just get to the nub of this, and I'll ask all of you this question. Mr. Bosco, as the designer and inventor of the pistol brace, did the ATF contact you for input or collaboration when it went to change the rule that you'd been relying on for 10 years?
No, they didn't. But for years, we worked with ATF to try to get to the bottom of parameters that we could work with to allow us to make a product that fit and suit what they thought the needs should be.
Ms. Swerd, as an expert in this area, were you contacted?
I was not, no.
Mr. Wilcox, I believe you initiated some of this with regard to pistol brace, the rule change. Am I wrong on that? I thought that's what you testified to earlier.
No, that's incorrect, sir.
You submitted a request through the portal. What did you request?
That was for the ghost gun regulation.
Oh, excuse me. So you requested a regulation change for ghost guns?
Yes, we submitted a petition for rulemaking through the formal process.
Okay. But you initiated that. That wasn't like they came to you. You initiated that, right?
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Larosier, were you, as a practitioner in this area, were you extended the opportunity by ATF to, did they call you and say, let's collaborate on this?
No, sir.
Okay. Mr. Larosier, were any laws changed in Congress to allow any of these things, the outlawing of the gun brace, the ghost gun law, or the zero tolerance policy? Anything that will authorize that zero tolerance policy by this body?
Absolutely not, sir.
Ms. Swear, is that accurate?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Did this body, this House of Representatives, Congress, and the President enact any law providing for control of ghost guns, outlawing pistol braces, or authorizing ATF to enact a zero tolerance policy?
No, it did not.
So this is essentially a bureaucratic institution that has decided it's going to impose its will, and that will is going to be imposed by one or two people at the top of the ATF, and then they're going to funnel it down to all the ATF workers to enforce. I want to tell you that is certainly antithetical to the Constitution of the United States and the separation of powers. So my constituents,
fear that what they legally possess today will soon be make them a felon through administrative rulemaking. One of my constituents tells me that the ATF is denying his 4th NFA tax stamp because information, the ATF says, that information is incorrect on his application. That's a technical issue. The only problem is that the ATF said the information was correct most recently in the same e-form that was correct in October of 2022. Another concerning example, FFL in my district was inspected by the ATF, and the agent took personal pictures of the FFL's records without the FFL's consent. This happened in my district. One constituent waited more than 450 days for ATF to resolve his suppressor application. I could go on. I've got a whole list of these things that have gone on in my district. And this is because ATF is basically run amok. It is a bureaucracy, and they're the same people that gave us Operation Fearless. If you remember, those of you may remember Operation Fearless, where they lost guns and weapons in Milwaukee. And then they came and testified before Congress that that sting operation, it was a mistake, yes, and we only did it in Milwaukee. And then reports came out. They'd done it all over the country in many locations. This is the same group of people that put together a Fast and Furious. And Fast and Furious, where traces indicated that a gun sold by the FFL was actually sold to ATF agents. And I'm told we should trust the ATF. They're a great agency. And I'm telling you, they're not. And I would just make a couple other quick comments here. I did think it was humorous when my friend, the ranking member Nadler, talked about the radicalist Supreme Court because he didn't like their ruling. I thought that was interesting. And I thought it's also interesting that he now supports AFT's rulings on the any of these bans. But guess what? He didn't say anything. He seemed to be okay with them for the previous 10 years. And they had controlled every arm of government, House, Senate, and the presidency. And they could have made all these changes through the appropriate mechanism, which is to introduce legislation, vote on it, debate on it, and if it passes, send it to the president. Couldn't get it done. So now what they want to do is resort to what they always want to do, and that's the authoritarian complex of the left, and I yield back.
Thank you. In closing, I want to thank our panelists once again for their important and insightful testimony today, all of you. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.